Before we begin tonight's journey, I want to take a moment to acknowledge you, wherever you may be in this vast world. Perhaps you're nestled in bed in New York City, where the distant hum of traffic provides a constant urban lullaby. Maybe you're in a quiet suburb of Atlanta, or resting peacefully in London as rain taps softly against your window. You might be in Lagos, Nigeria, where the morning sun is just beginning to paint the sky, or in Sydney, Australia, where afternoon light filters through your curtains. Wherever you are, whatever hour cradles you in this moment, thank you for being here. If you haven't already, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Your subscription helps us continue bringing you these carefully researched stories, told with the respect and gentleness they deserve. And if tonight's narrative brings you peace as you drift towards sleep, consider sharing it with someone who might also find comfort in these restful retellings. Now, let us begin. There's something achingly beautiful about a summer evening in a working-class neighborhood. The air hangs thick and warm. Children play basketball until the very last rays of sunlight disappear. Music drifts from open windows. Families gather on stoops and porches, talking and laughing as the day slowly releases its hold. These are the moments that define childhood in America's cities, ordinary, precious, and so easily taken for granted. On August 20th, 1978, in the Ivy Hill section of Newark, New Jersey, 5 teenage boys finished a game of pickup basketball as darkness began to settle over Clinton Avenue. They were planning to help a local contractor move some boxes that evening, easy work for a few extra dollars. It was summer vacation, and they had their whole lives ahead of them. By midnight, all 5 had vanished. No bodies were ever found. No definitive answers ever emerged. And for 33 years, their disappearance would haunt a city, torment their families, and become one of New Jersey's most enduring mysteries. This is the story of the Clinton Avenue 5, a gentle exploration of loss, memory, and the questions that echo across decades when young lives simply disappear into the darkness. So settle in comfortably. Let your breathing slow. And let me tell you about 5 boys who played basketball on a summer evening and never came home. To understand this story, we must first know the 5 young men whose names would become forever linked on that August night. They weren't statistics. They weren't just victims. They were sons, brothers, friends, each with their own dreams, personalities, and futures that should have unfolded over decades. Melvin Pittman was 17 years old that summer. He lived with his family in Newark's Ivy Hill neighborhood, a predominantly African-American working-class community where everyone knew everyone, where children grew up playing together on the same streets their parents had walked. Melvin was the kind of teenager who could often be found playing basketball at the local courts, his laughter carrying through the warm evening air. He had recently graduated from high school and was looking forward to figuring out his next steps, maybe work, maybe more education, maybe both. Ernest Taylor, also 17, was Melvin's close friend. They had grown up together, attended the same schools, played on the same basketball courts. Ernest came from a large family. He had multiple brothers and sisters who adored him. His family would later recall how Ernest lit up any room he entered, how his smile was infectious, how he had a natural way of making people feel comfortable and welcome. He was the kind of person people gravitated toward, whose presence made ordinary moments feel special. Alvin Turner was 16 years old, younger than Melvin and Ernest but welcomed into their circle nonetheless. Alvin lived with his mother, Floria Turner McDowell, who worked hard to provide for her children. He was a good student, respectful, the kind of teenager parents hoped their own children would befriend. Alvin had plans, not fully formed yet, because he was still so young, but plans nonetheless. He talked about maybe learning a trade, about making something of himself, about taking care of his mother when he got older. Randy Johnson, also 16, was known for his athleticism. He loved sports. Basketball especially, but really any game that involved competition and movement and the joy of physical activity. Randy had that boundless teenage energy that made him seem like he could run forever, like he would never slow down. His family would later say that he was always in motion, always going somewhere, always making plans with friends. The house felt quieter when Randy wasn't there. Michael McDowell, 16 years old, lived in nearby East Orange, New Jersey, but spent much of his time in Newark with his friends. Michael was particularly close to his sister Terry Lawson, who was 11 at the time. Terry idolized her older brother. She watched him carefully, memorizing his mannerisms, the way he walked, the way he laughed. Michael had told his family he might want to be a carpenter someday, to work with his hands, to build things that would last. He talked about this often, about creating something tangible and permanent. These 5 boys existed in that beautiful, precarious space between childhood and adulthood. They were old enough to work, to think about their futures, to navigate the world with increasing independence. But they were still young enough to play pickup basketball until dark, to roughhouse with their friends, to accept a job helping someone move boxes without questioning whether it might be dangerous. In the summer of 1978, Newark was a city in transition. The riots of 1967, sparked by racial tensions and police brutality, had devastated large parts of the city, leaving behind blocks of abandoned buildings and burned-out shells where homes and businesses once stood. The population had plummeted as white flight accelerated and middle-class families of all races sought opportunities in the suburbs. What remained was a city struggling with poverty, unemployment, and a police force that many residents viewed with deep mistrust. The Ivy Hill neighborhood where the 5 boys lived was somewhat insulated from the worst of Newark's problems, but the challenges were still present. There were abandoned buildings. There was crime. There were drugs. Parents tried to keep their children safe, but in a city where 2,600 abandoned buildings would catch fire that year alone, where entire blocks sat empty and decaying, perfect safety was impossible. Still, life went on. Children played. Families gathered. And on warm summer evenings, teenagers played basketball until darkness forced them inside. August 20th, 1978, was a Sunday, the last day of the weekend before another week began. The weather was perfect. Warm but not oppressively hot, with that particular quality of late summer light that seems almost golden. Melvin, Ernest, Alvin, Randy, and Michael spent the afternoon and early evening as they often did, playing basketball at the local court, talking, laughing, enjoying the simple pleasure of friendship and competition. As the sun began to set, the boys wrapped up their game and headed home for dinner. They had plans for later that evening. They were going to help Lee Anthony Evans, a local contractor, move some boxes. Evans was known in the neighborhood. He was in his mid-20s, a big man, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, muscular from his work in construction. People called him Big Man, and he had a reputation for hiring teenagers to help with odd jobs, paying them cash for a few hours of work. The boys had helped Evans before. It was easy money, load some boxes, unload some boxes, pocket $20 or $30. Nothing complicated. Nothing dangerous. Just a few hours of work on a summer evening. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that this would be the last normal evening of their lives. As darkness settled over Newark, the 5 boys prepared to meet up again. They had gone their separate ways for dinner, but they were planning to reconvene and help Lee Evans with his moving job. This was the pattern of their summer evenings. Basketball, dinner, then perhaps some easy work to earn spending money. At approximately 7 p.m., Randy Johnson was seen walking down Fabian Place, one of the streets in the Ivy Hill neighborhood. He was alone, heading in the direction where he was supposed to meet his friends. Witnesses would later tell police they saw him walking with purpose, like someone who had somewhere to be, someone who was on time for something important. Around the same time, just after dusk, Melvin Pittman was spotted walking past an ice cream parlor on Fabian Place. He too was alone, moving through the familiar streets of his neighborhood as he had done thousands of times before. There was nothing unusual about his behavior, nothing that suggested he was afraid or in danger. He was just a teenager on a summer evening, going to meet his friends. But it was what happened next that would become the most documented, and most haunting. part of that evening. Around 8 o'clock or 8:30 p.m., witnesses began seeing a pickup truck driving slowly through the neighborhood. The truck belonged to Lee Anthony Evans, and he was at the wheel. The truck bed was empty, ready to be loaded with whatever boxes or materials needed moving. Evans began picking up the boys, one by one. He would pull up to where they were waiting, they would climb into the truck bed or squeeze into the cab, and then he would drive to the next pickup point. This was apparently the plan: collect all 5 teenagers, drive to wherever the boxes were, unload them, and then pay the boys and drop them back home. Simple. Terry Lawson, Michael McDowell's 11-year-old sister, witnessed her brother's departure that evening. The memory would sear itself into her mind, remaining vivid even decades later. She was outside when Evans arrived in his pickup truck. He was wearing blue jeans, construction boots, and a blue t-shirt. Working clothes, nothing fancy or unusual. When Michael came out, I found it strange that he didn't get in from the passenger side, Terry would recall years later. Evans got out and Michael went in from the driver's side and he sat in the middle seat. This detail struck her as odd even at the time. Why would Evans get out of the truck and make Michael climb over to sit in the middle? It suggested that Evans wanted Michael right next to him, wanted him in the center position where he couldn't easily get out. When they drove off, I clearly remember the back of his head, and you see Michael and Evans' head right next to him. I watched that truck drive down Main Street. That's the last time I saw him. Other witnesses throughout the neighborhood reported seeing the pickup truck with teenagers in the back. Ernest Taylor, Alvin Turner, and either Melvin or Randy were spotted riding in the truck bed as Evans drove down Clinton Avenue. Multiple people saw this: the distinctive pickup truck, the group of black teenagers in back, Evans behind the wheel. It wasn't an unusual sight. Evans often hired teenagers from the neighborhood. No one thought anything was wrong. But there was a 6th teenager that evening, a boy whose life was saved by his father's intuition and a son's obedience. Roderick Royster was 16 years old, the same age as Alvin, Randy, and Michael. Roderick and his brother were both friends with the other 5 boys, and when Evans's truck pulled up, both Royster brothers climbed into the back with the others. There they were, 6 or 7 teenagers in the truck bed, ready to help with whatever work Evans had lined up. But Roderick's father happened to be outside at that moment. He saw the truck. He saw his sons in the back. And something about the scene troubled him. Perhaps it was intuition, perhaps it was the late hour, perhaps it was simply a father's protective instinct. Whatever it was, he called out to his sons. "You better get off that truck," he said, his voice carrying the authority that fathers in that era commanded, "or you're going to wake up and find yourself dead." Roderick and his brother immediately climbed out of the truck. They were obedient sons, and when their father gave an order, they followed it without argument or hesitation. They stood on the street and watched as Evans's truck drove away, carrying their 5 friends into the summer darkness. Years later, Roderick Royster would testify in court about that moment. "I always knew who was responsible for what happened next," he would say. From that very night, he had suspected. But knowing and proving are 2 different things, and proving would take more than 3 decades. The pickup truck with the 5 teenage boys was last seen on or near Clinton Avenue at approximately 11 p.m. Several witnesses spotted it driving through the neighborhood during that late hour. Then the truck disappeared into the night. And the 5 boys, Melvin Pittman, Ernest Taylor, Alvin Turner, Randy Johnson, and Michael McDowell, were never seen again. When the 5 boys didn't come home that night, their families initially weren't alarmed. Teenagers stay out late. They lose track of time. They decide to sleep over at a friend's house without calling home first. It was annoying, certainly, and their parents would scold them in the morning, but it wasn't immediately terrifying. But when Monday morning came, August 21, 1978, and the boys still hadn't returned, worry began to creep in. Phone calls started going back and forth between the families. Had anyone seen them? Did anyone know where they were? Had they said anything about staying somewhere overnight? No one knew anything. No one had seen them since the previous evening. The worry intensified. By Monday afternoon, the families began contacting the Newark Police Department. 5 teenage boys were missing. They had last been seen on Sunday evening in the Ivy Hill neighborhood. They had been picked up by a local contractor named Lee Anthony Evans to help him move boxes. Now they were gone. The police response was, according to later accounts, less than urgent. Teenagers run away. Teenagers get into trouble. In a city dealing with high crime rates and limited resources, 5 missing black teenagers were not the department's highest priority. The families were essentially told to wait, the boys would probably show up soon. But the boys didn't show up. Tuesday came and went. Wednesday. Thursday. With each passing day, the fear grew more acute. This wasn't normal. These weren't troubled kids with histories of running away. They had no police records. They weren't involved in gangs. They were good kids who played basketball and helped their mothers and went to school. Police did eventually begin investigating. They interviewed family members, friends, neighbors. They quickly identified Lee Anthony Evans as the last person seen with the 5 boys. Multiple witnesses had seen them get into his truck. Multiple witnesses had seen him driving around the neighborhood picking them up one by one. Detectives brought Evans in for questioning. He was cooperative, they would later report. He admitted that he had picked up the boys on Sunday evening. Yes, he had hired them to help him move some boxes from one location to another. Yes, he had driven them around in his truck. But he claimed he had dropped them all off safely on Clinton Avenue around 11 p.m. They had helped him unload the boxes, he had paid them their money, and then he had let them out of the truck near where he had picked them up. He had driven away and gone home. He had no idea what had happened to them after that. The story was plausible. Evans had often hired neighborhood teenagers. He had a reputation as a businessman, not a criminal. He had no record of violence. He wasn't known for inappropriate behavior toward young people. The police administered a polygraph test. A lie detector test, to Evans. According to official records, he passed. With no bodies, no physical evidence, no witnesses who had seen anything criminal, and a suspect who had passed a polygraph test, the investigation stalled. The Newark Police Department was already overwhelmed. In 1978 alone, the city would experience 2,600 fires in abandoned buildings, fires that firefighters often let burn rather than risk their lives entering structurally unsound buildings. There were murders to investigate, assaults, robberies. Resources were limited. The case of the 5 missing teenagers began to drift toward the cold case files. For the families, the agony was indescribable. Terry Lawson, Michael McDowell's sister, would later recall how her mother sat by the window for hours every night, waiting for Michael to come home. She would sit there for hours at night and no one could answer the phone because she was expecting a call from Michael, Terry remembered. The phone had to stay free, in case Michael called to say he needed a ride, or he was sorry, or he was coming home. Michael's mother never got that call. She died of leukemia 1 year after her son disappeared, still waiting by the window, still hoping he would walk through the door with some explanation for where he had been. The other families endured similar torment. Melvin Pittman's family searched. Ernest Taylor's brothers and sisters distributed flyers. Alvin Turner's mother, Floria, refused to believe her son was dead, even as years passed with no word. Randy Johnson's family held out hope that somehow, somewhere, he was alive. But as years turned into decades, hope became harder to maintain. There were occasional reported sightings, someone thought they saw one of the boys in another state, or working at a particular location. Each lead was investigated. Each turned out to be a case of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. The boys had disappeared so completely that it was as if they had been erased from existence. None of their fingerprints ever showed up in any database. Their social security numbers were never used. They never applied for driver's licenses or jobs or credit cards. If they were alive somewhere, they were living completely off the grid, which seemed increasingly unlikely as time passed. The most probable explanation, the one that everyone feared but no one could prove, was that all five had been murdered on the night they disappeared. The 1980s came and went. The five boys would have graduated from high school, perhaps gone to college or learned trades, gotten married, had children of their own. Their friends moved on with their lives, though they never forgot. Their families aged, carrying the weight of unresolved grief. The 1990s arrived. The case was more than a decade old. The Newark Police Department had changed leadership multiple times. The detectives who had initially worked the case had retired or moved on to other assignments. The file gathered dust. In 1996, 18 years after the disappearance, the New York Times published an article about the case titled, "After 18 Years, Newark Searches for Five Boys Who Vanished." The article brought renewed attention to the case, but no new leads emerged. It seemed that the mystery would remain forever unsolved. Psychics contacted the police, claiming they could locate the bodies or identify the killer. Tips came in sporadically. Someone had heard something, someone who knew something. Every lead was followed up, and every lead led nowhere. In the neighborhood, rumors persisted. Many residents remained convinced that Lee Anthony Evans was responsible. He had been the last person seen with the boys. His story about dropping them off safely had never quite rung true. But suspicion is not evidence, and the police needed evidence. Evans continued living in the Newark area, working as a contractor and brickmason. He maintained his innocence. He had cooperated with police. He had passed a polygraph test. He lived his life, married, had a family, went to work every day. If he knew what had happened to those five boys, he kept that knowledge locked inside himself. The abandoned building where, according to later testimony, the boys may have been killed was long gone, burned, demolished, the lot cleared. Dozens of other abandoned buildings had met the same fate. If there had been physical evidence at any crime scene, it had been destroyed decades earlier. The families held memorial services without bodies to bury. Some of them eventually had their sons declared legally dead so they could some form of closure, some way to mark the loss officially. But a death certificate without a body, without knowing what happened, without being able to say goodbye, that's not really closure at all. And then, in November 2008, 30 years after the five teenagers vanished, something happened that would change everything. Philander Hampton was 53 years old in November 2008. He was Lee Anthony Evans's cousin, and he had spent much of his adult life in and out of prison. Hampton had a lengthy criminal record, robbery, drug offenses, various other crimes that had resulted in multiple convictions. He was a heroin addict, a dealer, a man who had made poor choices throughout his life. In November 2008, Hampton was in police custody on an unrelated charge. He was facing significant prison time. And during his interrogation, a session that would last 13 hours, Hampton suddenly began talking about something from 3 decades earlier. He began talking about 5 teenage boys who had disappeared in August 1978. According to Hampton's confession, here's what had happened on that night. He and his cousin Lee Anthony Evans had been living at 256 Camden Street in Newark, not far from the Ivy Hill neighborhood where the boys lived. The house had multiple floors, and Hampton lived on the 3rd floor. Evans used the house for his contracting business and also, according to Hampton, dealt marijuana out of the residence. At some point shortly before August 20, 1978, the 5 teenage boys had broken into the house and stolen marijuana from Evans. How much marijuana? The accounts varied, some say it was 7 pounds, others say more or less. But it was a significant amount, worth considerable money. Evans was furious. These weren't random thieves, these were boys from the neighborhood, teenagers he had hired for odd jobs, kids who knew him. In his mind, they had betrayed his trust. They had stolen from him. And in the world of drug dealing, theft cannot go unpunished or you lose all credibility and respect. So Evans devised a plan. On the evening of August 20th, he would pick up the boys under the pretense of hiring them for a moving job. He would drive them to the house on Camden Street. And then he would make them pay for what they had taken. According to Hampton's confession, Evans picked up the 5 boys as planned. He drove them to 256, Camden Street. Once there, Evans ordered Hampton to get a gun and hold 2 of the boys at gunpoint while Evans rounded up the other 3. The boys realized too late that this wasn't about moving boxes. This was about the stolen marijuana. Evans forced all 5 boys upstairs to the 3rd floor, where Hampton lived. There was a bedroom closet on that floor, a small space, barely big enough for 5 people to squeeze into. Evans herded the terrified teenagers into the closet at gunpoint and locked them inside. And then, according to Hampton, Evans retrieved 5 gallons of gasoline. He poured it throughout the house. On the floors, on the walls, on the stairs. He made sure the accelerant would spread the fire quickly, would consume the entire structure. Then he set the house ablaze. The 5 boys, Melvin Pittman, Ernest Taylor, Alvin Turner, Randy Johnson, and Michael McDowell, perished in the fire, trapped in a 3rd-floor closet, unable to escape as flames consumed the building around them. After making this confession, Hampton offered to show investigators where the house had stood. In December 2008, he led detectives to the lot at 256, Camden Street. The house itself was long gone, burned in the fire and later demolished. But Hampton pointed out where it had been, described the layout, provided details about the interior that he claimed only someone who had been there could know. Investigators brought in sonar equipment and conducted searches of the lot, looking for human remains. But 3 decades of weather, construction, and urban development had transformed the site. If there had been remains in the rubble of the burned house, they were no longer detectable. This presented a problem for prosecutors. They had a confession, yes. But they had no bodies. No physical evidence. No DNA. No forensic proof that the 5 boys had ever been in that house, let alone died there. All they had was Hampton's word, and Hampton was a career criminal with every reason to lie if it would get him a better deal. Still, the confession was detailed and specific. Hampton knew things about the case that hadn't been made public. His description of Evans's anger over the stolen marijuana aligned with what some witnesses had said about Evans's personality. And crucially, Hampton's timeline matched the known facts. The boys were last seen with Evans on the night of August 20th, 1978, and a house at 256, Camden Street had indeed burned that summer. For 18 months, detectives investigated Hampton's claims. They re-interviewed witnesses from 1978. They searched property records and fire department reports. They built a case. And in March 2010, 32 years after the 5 boys disappeared, Lee Anthony Evans and Philander Hampton were arrested and charged with 5 counts of felony murder and 5 counts of arson. The arrests made headlines. After 3 decades of silence, the Clinton Avenue 5 case was suddenly front-page news again. The families of the missing boys, some of whom had waited 32 years for this moment, expressed a mixture of relief and anguish. Finally, someone was being held accountable. Finally, there would be answers. Finally, there would be justice. But legal proceedings moved slowly, and nothing about this case would be straightforward. Both Evans and Hampton were initially held on $5 million bail each. But almost immediately, complications arose. Evans's attorney pointed out that his client had no criminal record, had lived in the community for decades, had cooperated with police in 1978, and had passed a polygraph test back then. Judge Peter Vasquez ultimately reduced Evans's bail to $950,000. Evans's family posted the bail using 3 pieces of property, and on August 20, 2010, exactly 32 years to the day after the boys disappeared, Lee Anthony Evans was released from jail to await trial. Meanwhile, prosecutors offered Philander Hampton a plea deal. If he would plead guilty and agree to testify against Evans, they would recommend a sentence of just 10 years in prison, plus $15,000 in relocation expenses to help him start over somewhere else after his release. For a man facing potential life sentences for 5 murders, this was an extraordinarily generous offer. Hampton accepted. In August 2011, he pleaded guilty to all 5 murder charges and formally agreed to testify against his cousin. He was sentenced to the 10 years as promised and also awarded the $15,000 relocation payment. This arrangement troubled many observers. A career criminal and admitted heroin addict, who by his own confession had held a gun on teenagers while they were murdered, was being paid $15,000 by the state and would serve only 10 years for his involvement in killing 5 people. Meanwhile, Lee Anthony Evans, who had never been convicted of any violent crime, was facing the possibility of life in prison based primarily on Hampton's testimony. Lee Evans's trial began in November 2011. In a highly unusual move, Evans chose to represent himself. He did have an attorney, Olubukola Adechola, assigned to assist him, but Evans insisted on conducting his own defense. He explained to the court, "The defense is not in my best interest. Since March 2010, when I was arrested, neither one of the attorneys has asked me if I was innocent." Legal experts shook their heads at this decision. There's an old legal adage that a person who represents himself has a fool for a client. Evans had no legal training, no experience with criminal procedure, no knowledge of how to cross-examine witnesses or introduce evidence. The judge warned him that this was a terrible idea. But Evans insisted. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on Philander Hampton's testimony. Hampton took the stand and repeated his confession, that Evans had been furious about the stolen marijuana, that they had lured the boys to the house with the promise of work, that Evans had trapped them in a closet and set the house on fire. But under cross-examination, even from the legally unsophisticated Evans, Hampton's testimony began to unravel. His story had inconsistencies. Details changed between his confession and his court testimony. He admitted to being a heroin addict at the time of the alleged murders. He acknowledged his long criminal record. And perhaps most damaging to his credibility, he admitted that he was receiving $15,000 from the state in exchange for this testimony, in addition to the favorable plea deal. The prosecution also presented testimony from Rogers Taylor, the brother of victim Ernest Taylor. Taylor testified that in 2008, before Hampton's confession, Lee Evans had allegedly confessed to him directly. According to Taylor, Evans had admitted involvement in the murders during a private conversation. But this testimony too had problems. During the trial, Taylor made an additional claim. He said that a court watcher named Gary Ewing had come to his house the night before his testimony and attempted to intimidate him. The judge investigated this claim and determined that Taylor had fabricated the entire story. Taylor was caught lying under oath about the intimidation. If he lied about that, the defense argued, how could the jury trust anything he said, including the alleged confession from Evans? Evans, despite his lack of legal training, managed to make several effective points in his defense. He pointed out that he had cooperated with police in 1978. He noted that he had passed a polygraph test. He emphasized the complete lack of physical evidence, no bodies, no DNA, no forensic proof of any kind. He argued that Hampton's story was implausible. How could 5 strong teenage boys be forced into a closet and held there without any signs of struggle? How could a house burn so completely that it left absolutely no trace of 5 human bodies? How could this massive fire in a residential neighborhood not be noticed or reported at the time? The trial lasted several weeks. The prosecution called approximately 20 witnesses. Evans fumbled through some of his cross-examinations but managed to raise enough doubt about Hampton's credibility. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. After deliberating, the jury returned to the courtroom. The verdict was read. Not guilty on all counts. Not guilty of 5 counts of felony murder. Not guilty of 5 counts of murder. Not guilty of arson. On every single charge, the jury found Lee Anthony Evans not guilty. The courtroom erupted. The families of the victims were devastated. Some cried. Some shouted. How could this be? After 33 years, after a confession, after all the testimony, how could the man they were certain had killed their sons and brothers be walking free? But the jury had spoken. They had not found the evidence convincing beyond a reasonable doubt. Hampton's testimony alone, without any physical evidence to support it, was not enough. Lee Anthony Evans walked out of the courthouse a free man in November 2011. The case was officially closed. There would be no retrial. Double jeopardy protections meant Evans could never be prosecuted again for these crimes. In 2013, Evans even filed a lawsuit against the Essex County Prosecutor's Office, the Newark Police Department, and then Mayor Cory Booker, claiming his arrest had been politically motivated and constituted malicious prosecution. That lawsuit was eventually dismissed, but Evans maintained his innocence and his anger at having been prosecuted. Philander Hampton served his 10-year sentence and was released from custody in February 2017. With his $15,000 relocation payment, he disappeared into a new life somewhere else. The families of the 5 victims were left with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. Some believe Evans got away with murder. Others acknowledge that the prosecution's case had serious weaknesses and that perhaps justice was served by his acquittal, even if it feels unsatisfying. The bodies of Melvin Pittman, Ernest Taylor, Alvin Turner, Randy Johnson, and Michael McDowell have never been found. They remain, officially, missing persons. Their families have no graves to visit, no final resting places where they can lay flowers and say prayers. Terry Lawson, Michael McDowell's sister, is now in her 50s. She still remembers watching her brother climb into that pickup truck on August 20, 1978, still remembers the back of his head as the truck drove away. That memory has remained crystal clear for nearly 50 years. The other families carry similar memories. Last images of their sons, their brothers, their friends. A basketball game in the fading light. A smile and a wave goodbye. A promise to be home soon. And then nothing. Just absence stretching across decades. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider the mystery of absence. How lives can simply end without warning, without explanation, without the closure that allows the living to move on. The Clinton Avenue 5 remain frozen in time. Forever 17 and 16, forever young, forever on their way to help move some boxes on a summer evening. Their case stands as a reminder of how fragile life is, how quickly ordinary moments can become tragic, and how some questions remain forever unanswered even when we think we know the truth. Did Lee Anthony Evans kill those 5 boys? A jury said the evidence didn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Did Philander Hampton tell the truth or concoct a story to get a better deal? We may never know with certainty. What we do know is that 5 young men with their whole lives ahead of them disappeared on August 20, 1978, and never came home. And somewhere, whether in the ashes of a long-demolished building or in some other location yet undiscovered, 5 families are still waiting for their sons to come home. Rest peacefully tonight. And remember that every person who vanishes leaves behind a constellation of people who love them, who wait for them, who carry their memory forward even when answers never come. Good night, Melvin. Good night, Ernest. Good night, Alvin. Good night, Randy. Good night, Michael. You are remembered. You are loved. And your stories have been told with the gentleness and respect you deserve. Before we journey into tonight's story, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge you, wherever you find yourself in this moment. Perhaps you're settling into bed in Denver, where mountain air fills your lungs and stars shine clear and bright. Maybe you're in Miami, where ocean breezes drift through your window, or in Chicago, where city lights create their own constellation. You might be in London, where rain taps a gentle rhythm, or in Tokyo, where morning light is just beginning to paint the sky soft shades of pink and gold. Wherever you are, whatever time zone holds you, thank you for being here. If you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, I gently invite you to do so. Your subscription helps us continue crafting these carefully researched stories, told with the respect and tenderness they deserve. And if tonight's narrative brings you peace as you drift toward rest, consider sharing it with someone who might also find comfort in these gentle retellings. Now, let us begin. There's something magical about December evenings when you're 12 years old. The world feels full of possibility. Christmas lights twinkle on every street. School concerts fill auditoriums with proud parents and nervous children. And when you're part of an honors choir, when you've been selected to perform at a special Christmas concert, when you're wearing your best outfit and singing carols for an audience, well, that feels like being part of something important, something beautiful. On the evening of December 20th, 1984, in the small city of Greeley, Colorado, a 12-year-old girl named Jonelle Matthews performed with her middle school honors choir. She sang Christmas carols. She smiled under the stage lights. And when the concert ended, she asked a friend's father for a ride home. That simple request, that ordinary moment of a child wanting to get home, would be the last time Jonelle Matthews was seen alive. This is Jonelle's story. Not a story of darkness, but one of light, the light she brought into the world during her 12 years, and the light her memory continues to shine more than 40 years later. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. And let me tell you about a girl who loved to sing, and how her voice, though silenced too soon, still echoes through the years. Jonelle Renee Matthews was born on February 9, 1972, in Santa Barbara, California. Her birth mother, Terry Vieira, was just 13 years old, herself still a child when she gave birth to a daughter. The infant was adopted 6 weeks later by Jim and Gloria Matthews, a couple who had already adopted one daughter and were eager to expand their family with another. The Matthews family eventually moved from California to Greeley, Colorado, a city of about 60,000 people nestled at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. Greeley was, and remains, a place defined by wide skies, agricultural lands, and the kind of community where neighbors know each other's names. It's a college town, home to the University of Northern Colorado, but it maintains that small-town feeling where families can put down roots and children can grow up safely. Jim Matthews worked in education and would eventually become the principal of Platte Valley Elementary School in nearby Kersey. Gloria devoted herself to being a mother, creating a warm and loving home for Jonelle and her older sister, Jennifer. The Matthews were active members of the Sunny View Church of the Nazarene, where faith and community wove together to form the fabric of their lives. By all accounts, Jonelle was a typical 12-year-old girl in the best possible ways. She loved music and had been selected for Franklin Middle School's honors choir, a significant achievement that required talent, dedication, and hours of practice. She had friends who adored her. Her best friend, Deanna Ross, would later recall how they spent their childhood together. We had sleepovers, birthday parties. We just had a big group of friends. They rode their bikes around town, played in neighborhoods where everyone felt safe, lived the kind of innocent childhood that becomes increasingly rare. Another friend, Darla Jench, lived near the Matthews family on 43rd Avenue Court. "I'm so fortunate that we were neighbors," Darla would later say, her voice still carrying the weight of lost decades after Jonelle disappeared. The girls of that neighborhood formed a tight-knit group, the kind where you could knock on any door and be welcomed in for cookies and conversation. Jonelle was in 7th grade that fall of 1984. She was at that awkward, beautiful age where childhood and adolescence overlap, still young enough to be excited about Christmas, but old enough to take pride in her musical accomplishments. She was developing her own personality, her own interests, her own sense of who she might become. She had her whole life stretching out before her like a blank page waiting to be filled with adventures and achievements and love. The Matthews family lived at 320 43rd Avenue Court, in a modest, well-kept home in a neighborhood called Pheasant Run. It was the kind of neighborhood where people left their front doors unlocked, where children played outside until the streetlights came on, where everyone watched out for everyone else's kids. It felt safe. It felt like home. In December 1984, as Christmas approached, the Matthews family was busy with all the normal holiday preparations. Jennifer, Jonel's older sister, was in high school and playing basketball. Jim and Gloria were juggling work and holiday shopping and church activities. And Jonel was preparing for the big Christmas concert where her honors choir would perform. On the evening of December 20th, 1984, 5 days before Christmas, everything seemed perfectly, beautifully ordinary. The Christmas concert was being held that evening at the Intrawest Bank of Denver in Greeley. It was a special event, the kind of performance that draws parents, grandparents, community members, all eager to hear young voices singing the songs of the season. Jonel's Franklin Middle School Honors Choir had been rehearsing for weeks, perfecting their harmonies, learning their parts. But that evening, there was a conflict in the Matthews household. Jennifer had a basketball game scheduled for the same time as Jonel's concert. Jim Matthews, faced with the impossible choice that parents sometimes must make, decided to attend Jennifer's game. After all, Jonel had friends who would be at the concert. She would have people to sit with, to celebrate with. Gloria Matthews stayed home that evening, the details of why aren't entirely clear, but it meant that neither of Jonel's parents would be in the audience to hear her sing. Jonel didn't seem bothered by this. She was 12, independent, excited about the performance itself. She got ready carefully that evening, putting on her best outfit, a dress, stockings, nice shoes. She made sure she had her music folder with all her sheet music. And then she headed to the concert, probably getting a ride from a friend's parent or perhaps walking the relatively short distance to the bank. The concert was lovely. Young voices filled the space with Silent Night and Deck the Halls, and all the traditional carols that marked the season. Parents beamed. Teachers nodded approvingly. And somewhere in that choir, Jonel Matthews sang her part, her voice blending with her classmates, creating something beautiful and fleeting and precious. The concert ended around 8 p.m. Parents began collecting their children, heading home to warm houses and hot chocolate. Jonel looked around for her ride home and spotted her best friend Deanna Ross with Deanna's father, Russell Ross. Russell was there to pick up Deanna, and when Jonel saw them, she did what any 12-year-old would do, she asked for a ride home. Russell Ross was happy to oblige. He was a kind man, a good father, the kind of person you could trust with your child. Jonel and Deanna climbed into his car, probably chattering about the concert, about how well it had gone, about their holiday plans. It was a short drive to the Matthews home on 43rd Avenue Court, just a few minutes through quiet Greeley streets. Russell pulled up to 320, 43rd Avenue Court at approximately 8:15 p.m. The house was dark, Gloria wasn't home yet, and Jim was still at Jennifer's basketball game. Jonel would be home alone for perhaps 30 minutes to an hour, but this wasn't unusual. She was 12 years old, responsible, capable of being by herself for a short time. Thousands of 12-year-olds across America were home alone that very evening, fixing themselves snacks, watching TV, waiting for their parents to return. But Russell Ross was a careful man. He wanted to make sure Jonel got inside safely. So they had a system, one they had apparently used before. Jonel would go into the house, and once inside, she would flip the light switch on and off to signal to Russell that she was safely in. It was a simple gesture, a small kindness, but it represented the way that community worked, adults looking after children, making sure everyone got home safe. Jonel climbed out of the car. She walked up to her front door. She went inside. And true to her word, she flicked the light switch on and off. Russell Ross saw the signal. Everything was fine. Jonel was home safe. He drove away with Deanna, probably not giving it another thought. It was just another ordinary evening, another simple act of neighborly kindness, another moment that seemed completely unremarkable at the time. It was approximately 8:30 p.m. when Jonelle disappeared inside her house and flicked that light. Russell, Ross and Deanna drove away, heading to their own home. The street was quiet. Snow lay on the ground from an earlier snowfall, covering the neighborhood in that peculiar winter stillness. And inside 320, 43rd Avenue Court, Jonelle Matthews was alone. That was the last time anyone who loved her ever saw her. Jim Matthews arrived home from Jennifer's basketball game at approximately 9:30 p.m., about an hour after Jonelle had been dropped off. He pulled into the driveway, probably thinking about what a nice evening it had been, probably planning to ask Jonelle how the concert had gone. He opened the front door and called out for his daughter. Silence greeted him. The house had an eerie quality to it, not ransacked, not disturbed, but not quite right either. Jim noticed Jonelle's shoes sitting by a chair, as if she'd kicked them off when she came in. Her stockings were thrown over the couch. She had probably been relieved to take them off, to get comfortable after being dressed up for the concert. These were the normal signs of a 12-year-old coming home and making herself comfortable. But where was Jonelle herself? Jim called her name again. He checked her bedroom, empty. He looked in the bathroom, the kitchen, all the obvious places. No Jonelle. He felt the first stirrings of concern. Where could she have gone? Had she decided to walk to a friend's house without leaving a note? That would be unlike her, but maybe. Gloria Matthews arrived home shortly after Jim. "Do you know where Jonelle is?" Jim asked her. Gloria didn't know. She had assumed Jonelle was home safe from the concert. Jennifer arrived home around 10 p.m. "Do you know where Jonelle is?" The question was asked again, the concern growing more acute. None of them knew. Jonelle had simply vanished. Jim Matthews called Deanna Ross's family. Yes, Russell had dropped Jonelle off at home around 8:15 or 8:30, Russell confirmed. She had gone inside. She had flicked the light. Everything had seemed fine. Jim called other friends, other families. No one had seen Jonelle. No one knew where she might be. By late evening, the Matthews family contacted the Greeley Police Department. Their 12-year-old daughter was missing. She had come home from a school concert and now she was gone. The police responded quickly. This was a small city, and a missing child was taken seriously. Officers arrived at 320, 43rd Avenue Court and began their initial investigation. What they found was puzzling. There were no signs of a struggle inside the house. Nothing appeared to be disturbed or out of place beyond Jonelle's shoes and stockings. The front door had apparently been unlocked when Jim arrived home, but that wasn't unusual. Many families in Greeley still left their doors unlocked in 1984. The critical clues were outside the house, in the snow. Officers discovered footprints in the snow around the Matthews home, footprints that didn't belong to family members, footprints that suggested someone had been around the property that evening. Even more significant, someone had taken a garden rake and attempted to erase or cover some of the footprints in the snow. This was the clearest indication of foul play. Someone had tried to hide their tracks, literally. Lieutenant Paul Branham, one of the initial investigators, told reporters. There were no signs of a struggle, but there are indications of possible foul play. The police regarded the case immediately as a possible kidnapping. By the next morning, December 21st, a massive search operation was underway. Greeley Police, the FBI, dozens of volunteers formed search lines and walked through fields near the Matthews home. They questioned neighbors. Had anyone seen anything unusual? Heard anything? Noticed any strangers in the neighborhood? They spoke with Jonelle's teachers and friends, trying to piece together her final hours. The community of Greeley was shocked and frightened. This was supposed to be a safe town, a place where children could be children. If a 12-year-old girl could vanish from her own home on a Thursday evening, then no one was truly safe. Parents suddenly became hypervigilant. Children who had been allowed to play outside unsupervised were now kept close. Doors that had been left unlocked were suddenly bolted and chained. The Matthews family was thrust into a nightmare. Jim and Gloria appeared on local television, pleading for information. "Please, if anyone has seen Jonelle, if anyone knows anything, please come forward," Gloria said, her voice breaking. "We just want her home safe." The pain in their faces was evident to everyone who saw those broadcasts. The media descended on Greeley. What had seemed like a safe, unremarkable American community was suddenly national news. The case received massive coverage, partly because it tapped into every parent's deepest fear, that a child could simply vanish from their own home, without warning, without reason. Days turned into weeks. Christmas came and went, a holiday the Matthews family barely acknowledged, too consumed with grief and fear to celebrate anything. There was an empty chair at their dinner table. There were unopened presents under their tree. There was a silence in their home that nothing could fill. As the investigation continued with no breaks, Jonelle Matthews became part of a new and heartbreaking phenomenon in American life. In the early 1980s, the nation was becoming increasingly aware of the epidemic of missing children. High-profile cases like that of Eton Patz, who disappeared in New York City in 1979, and Adam Walsh, abducted from a Florida shopping center in 1981, had captured national attention and sparked conversations about child safety. Jonelle became one of the first milk carton kids, children whose faces appeared on the sides of milk cartons as part of a nationwide effort to find missing children. Every morning, families across America would pour milk into their cereal and see Jonelle's face looking back at them. Missing, Jonelle Matthews, age 12, last seen, Greeley, Colorado, December 20, 1984. It was a simple idea: use everyday products as a way to keep missing children in the public eye, to turn millions of Americans into potential witnesses who might spot a missing child. Jonelle's case was one of the first to receive this treatment, and while it raised awareness, it also meant that her family's private tragedy became unavoidably public. There was no escaping the reality of Jonelle's disappearance when her face was on every breakfast table in America. In March 1985, just 3 months after Jonelle went missing, something extraordinary happened. President Ronald Reagan himself mentioned Jonelle's case during a White House event. "I learned about Jonelle Matthews of Greeley, Colorado," the president said. 5 days before Christmas, Jonelle disappeared from her home. The president's attention brought even more focus to the case, but it didn't bring Jonelle home. Despite all the attention, despite thousands of tips called into police, despite extensive searches and investigations, the case went cold. There was simply no evidence to follow. No witnesses had seen Jonelle leave her house. No one had seen a suspicious vehicle in the neighborhood. The footprints in the snow had been partially obscured by the rake. There were no fingerprints, no DNA evidence. DNA analysis was still in its infancy in 1984, no physical clues that pointed to any specific person. Investigators developed theories. Had Jonelle been kidnapped by a stranger? Had she been taken by someone she knew? Was this a random act, or had someone been targeting her specifically? Every theory led to dead ends. For the Matthews family, life became divided into before and after. Before Jonelle disappeared, they were a normal family with normal concerns. After, they were a family defined by absence, by a missing piece that could never be replaced. Gloria Matthews would later tell reporters that everywhere they went, she found herself looking for Jonelle. "In my dreams she always came home," Gloria said. She always came home. But in reality, there was no sign of Jonelle. No credible sightings. No ransom demands. No body found. She had simply vanished as completely as if she'd never existed at all, except she had existed, and the people who loved her carried that loss every single day. In 1994, 10 years after her disappearance, Jonelle Matthews was legally declared dead. This was a common procedure for long-term missing persons cases. It allowed families to settle estates, to make legal decisions, to have some form of official closure even without a body. But a death certificate couldn't fill the hole that Jonel's absence had left. Then, in 1997, something unexpected happened. The Matthews family received a letter that opened up an entirely new dimension to their grief. The letter was from Terry Vieira Martinez, Jonel's birth mother. Terry had used a search consultant to try to locate the daughter she had given up for adoption 25 years earlier. Through her search, she had learned that the baby girl she'd last seen when she was 13 years old was named Jonel Matthews. What Terry didn't know, what the search consultant hadn't told her, was that Jonel had disappeared more than a decade earlier. The letter was poignant. My name is Terry Vieira Martinez. On February 9, 1972, I gave birth to a baby girl at Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara, California. A search consultant recently helped me locate the baby I gave up for adoption. After extensive efforts, it was found that her name is Jonel Matthews. I hope that your hearts will be open for a possible reunion sometime in the future. Gloria Matthews had to write back with devastating news: there would be no reunion. Jonel was gone. The two families, the adoptive family who had raised and lost Jonel, and the birth mother who had never known her, bonded over their shared grief. Terry Vieira Martinez became part of the larger circle of people who mourned Jonel and wondered what had happened to her. The Matthews family eventually moved away from Greeley. The house on 43rd Avenue Court held too many memories, too much pain. Jim and Gloria became missionaries, moving to the Philippines and later to Costa Rica, channeling their grief into service and faith. Jennifer, Jonel's sister, married and moved away from Colorado, starting her own family, carrying the weight of being the sister who survived. But even thousands of miles away, even with decades passing, the question remained: what happened to Jonel Matthews? As the years passed, police never entirely gave up on Jonel's case. The file remained open. And periodically, new tips would come in, new leads would be investigated. One name kept appearing in the investigation over the years: Stephen Dana Pankey. Stephen Pankey lived in Greeley in 1984. He was a member of the same church as the Matthews family, Sunny View Church of the Nazarene. He had a wife, Angela Hicks, and a young son. He worked various jobs and harbored political ambitions. By all accounts, he was an odd man. Intelligent but socially awkward, opinionated, difficult to get along with. Years later, his attorney would suggest he had Asperger's syndrome, which might have explained some of his peculiar behaviors. But what made Pankey a person of interest in Jonel's disappearance wasn't just that he lived in the same community or attended the same church. It was that he couldn't seem to stop talking about the case. He inserted himself into the investigation repeatedly over the decades, volunteering information, making odd statements, behaving in ways that drew attention. According to later testimony, Pankey contacted the FBI just 1 month after Jonel disappeared, claiming he wanted to provide information. He mentioned specific details about the case, including that a rake had been used to cover footprints in the snow. This was a detail that had not been made public. How did Pankey know about the rake unless he had been there? In church services after Jonel's disappearance, Pankey made strange comments. When a minister expressed hope that Jonel would be found safe, Angela Hicks, Pankey's wife at the time, heard her husband mutter something about the minister being a false prophet, suggesting Pankey knew Jonel wouldn't be found alive. Years later, in 2008, tragedy struck the Pankey family when their son was murdered. At the son's funeral, Angela Hicks reportedly heard Pankey say something chilling: "I hope God didn't allow this to happen because of Jonel Matthews." It was an odd thing to say. Why would God be punishing Pankey for something related to Jonel's disappearance unless Pankey had been involved? Angela also remembered disturbing details from the time of Jonel's disappearance. She recalled a car on their property that had been set on fire, burned from the inside out. Shortly after Jonel went missing. What had Pankey been burning? Why had he destroyed that vehicle? Pankey also mentioned to his wife that he drove home a different way on the night of December 20, 1984, the night Jonel disappeared. Why would he remember his route home from church so specifically all those years later, unless that night held particular significance. In the years after Jonel's disappearance, Pankey and his family moved away from Greeley, eventually settling in Idaho. And there, remarkably, Pankey decided to run for public office. He ran for governor of Idaho twice, once as a Constitution Party candidate in 2014, and once in the Republican primary in 2018. He never came close to winning, but the campaigns gave him a platform to express his views and to stay in the public eye. Throughout all these years, Pankey kept track of Jonel's case with what could only be described as obsessive interest. He followed news coverage. He searched for information online. He contacted law enforcement periodically, offering theories, asking for immunity in exchange for information. His behavior was so unusual, so persistent, that police began to view him as more than just an interested citizen. He was a suspect. But suspicion isn't evidence. For decades, police had nothing concrete to tie Pankey to Jonel's disappearance. They had his odd statements, his suspicious behavior, his inability to stay away from the case. But they had no physical evidence, no witnesses, no proof. That all changed on July 23, 2019. On a hot summer afternoon in July 2019, a crew of workers was installing a new oil and gas pipeline in a rural area of Weld County, Colorado. They were digging in a field at the intersection of County Roads 34.5 and 49, about 15 miles southeast of where the Matthews family had once lived. The area was remote, agricultural, the kind of place you drive past without noticing. At 4:50 p.m., one of the excavators hit something that wasn't dirt or rock. The operator stopped the machinery and climbed down to investigate. What he found made him immediately call for his supervisor. They had unearthed human remains. Police were contacted. The Weld County Coroner's Office responded to the scene. As investigators carefully excavated the area, they discovered that the remains were those of a young person who had been buried in this field for a very long time. The body was clothed, still wearing the same outfit they had on when they died. Using dental records, the distinctive 5 silver caps on the back molars that 12-year-old Jonel Matthews had received from her dentist, the Weld County Coroner's Office positively identified the remains as belonging to Jonel Renee Matthews. After 34 years, 9 months, and 3 days, Jonel had finally been found. The news hit Greeley and the wider community like a thunderbolt. The girl on the milk cartons, the case that had haunted a generation, the mystery that had never been solved, there was finally an answer, though not the one anyone had hoped for all those years ago. The discovery of Jonel's remains transformed the case from a missing person investigation to a homicide investigation. The medical examiner determined that Jonel had died from a single gunshot wound to the head. She had been murdered shortly after she was taken from her home on December 20, 1984. Her body had been transported to this remote field and buried, hidden away in a place where, without the random chance of a pipeline installation, she might never have been found. The Matthews family, now scattered across the world, received the news with mixed emotions. Jim and Gloria Matthews, the parents who had waited 35 years for any word of their daughter, finally had an answer. But it wasn't the answer they had hoped for. "In my dreams she always came home," Gloria had said. But Jonel would never truly come home now, only her remains, to be laid to rest at last. Jennifer Mogensen, Jonel's older sister, spoke about the complex grief of finally knowing. "Wow," she said simply when she heard the news. It was shock and relief and renewed grief all at once. The discovery also meant that police could now pursue this case as a homicide. And their prime suspect, the man who had been inserting himself into this case for 35 years, the man who knew details he shouldn't have known, was Stephen Pankey. On October 13, 2020, 36 years after Jonel Matthews disappeared, a grand jury indicted Stephen Dana Pankey on charges of first-degree murder, second-degree kidnapping, and false reporting. He was arrested in Idaho and extradited to Colorado to face trial. The first trial began in October 2021. Prosecutors presented their case, which was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence and Pankey's own statements over the years. There was no DNA evidence linking Pankey to the crime. After 35 years in the ground, no usable DNA could be recovered from Jonel's remains or clothing. There were no eyewitnesses who had seen Pankey at the Matthews home that night. There was no physical evidence, no murder weapon, nothing concrete. What prosecutors did have was Pankey's behavior. His obsessive interest in the case. His knowledge of details that hadn't been made public, like the rake used to cover footprints. His odd statements to his wife and at church services. His claim that he had driven a different route home that night. The car fire on his property shortly after Jonel disappeared. The defense argued that Pankey was simply a true crime enthusiast with Asperger's syndrome who had become fixated on a case that happened in his community. They pointed out that Pankey had no known connection to Jonel or her family. He wasn't a pedophile, he had no history of inappropriate behavior with children. There was no motive for him to harm Jonel. The defense suggested that the real killer was probably a man named Norris Drake, who had lived across the street from the Matthews family and who had a known obsession with young girls. Drake had since died and could never be questioned. After weeks of testimony, the jury in the first trial couldn't reach a verdict. They were deadlocked on the murder and kidnapping charges. A mistrial was declared on those counts, though the jury did convict Pankey of the false reporting charge. He had lied about certain details to police over the years. Prosecutors decided to retry Pankey. The second trial began in October 2022. This time, prosecutors refined their approach. They emphasized Pankey's hatred of law enforcement, suggesting that his motive for killing Jonel might have been to demonstrate how incompetent the police were, to commit the perfect crime, and show his superiority. They also suggested possible connections to the church, that perhaps Pankey had crossed paths with Jonel there in ways no one remembered. On October 31, 2022, Halloween, the jury in the second trial reached a verdict. They found Stephen Pankey guilty of felony murder and second-degree kidnapping. He was found not guilty of first-degree murder with deliberation, but guilty of the lesser charge of felony murder, meaning he had killed Jonel while committing another felony, kidnapping. The Matthews family was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. Jim Matthews, Jonel's father, addressed Pankey directly during sentencing. As these two trials have shown, you have been obsessed with your actions, and your consciousness could not let you forget. You have been a prisoner of your own mind. Judge Timothy Kearns sentenced Pankey to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. It was the maximum sentence allowed under the laws that were in place in 1984. Gloria Matthews, Jonel's mother, spoke about forgiveness, or her inability to offer it. I cannot forgive him how he killed Jonel, she said. I have a problem because so many Christians have said I need to forgive. But I feel God is the only one who can forgive the evil, and I feel this is evil. Pankey himself spoke briefly at sentencing, maintaining his innocence to the end. I am a Christian. I will be in heaven. I am innocent, and this is not justice for Jonel. Tonight, as you prepare to drift into sleep, consider the life of Jonel Matthews. Not as a victim, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a 12-year-old girl who loved music, who had friends she cared about, who sang in an honors choir, who was excited about Christmas. Consider her family, who waited 35 years for answers, who never gave up hope even when hope seemed impossible. Consider how they transformed their grief into missionary work, into service, into faith that sustained them through decades of not knowing. And consider how one December evening changed everything, how quickly safety can become danger, how fast ordinary moments can become extraordinary tragedies. The house at 320, 43rd Avenue Court still stands in Greeley, though it has changed hands many times since the Matthews family lived there. Different families have made it their home, created their own memories within its walls. But in the community of Greeley, that address will always be associated with Jonel. With the girl who went inside and flicked the light to signal she was safe, not knowing that she wasn't safe at all. Jonel's case helped change how America thinks about missing children. The milk cartons bearing her face led to a national conversation about child safety, about how to protect children, about how to find them when they go missing. The case contributed to the development of Amber Alerts and other systems designed to quickly mobilize communities when children disappear. A chokecherry tree was once planted at Franklin Middle School in Jonel's memory. The tree eventually died, and a plaque with her name disappeared. But Jonel herself has not been forgotten. Her voice, which sang Christmas carols on a December evening in 1984, still echoes through the years, a reminder that every child deserves safety, that every parent deserves peace, and that justice, even when delayed for decades, still matters. Stephen Pankey sits in prison tonight, maintaining his innocence. The Matthews family finally has some measure of closure, though the word seems inadequate for the decades of grief they've endured. Jonel rests at last, her remains finally laid to rest with the dignity and love she deserved. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that Jonel Matthews is remembered. Not as a cold case file or a face on a milk carton, but as a girl who brought light into the world during her 12 years, and whose memory continues to shine, reminding us all of the preciousness of life and the importance of cherishing every moment we have with those we love. Good night, Jonel. Your song has ended, but its echo remains.